So, chapter 4 is all about cells. When we looked at chapter 1 at the end, it talked about the four prevailing theories within biology, and the cell theory was one of those. The cell theory essentially states that all living things are made of cells, and all of those cells came from pre existing cells, so cells that were already there. For cell theory, we had this major theory of spontaneous generation, where living things would more or less come from non living things. So there was this idea and then observation that people made that if they put corn and rags in the corner of their house, then it would create mice, because when they did that, there were now mice in their house. Now we know that that was because of the availability of the food. But before they knew about all of these things with cells and reproduction, that was the best idea that they had at the time. Okay? But that has now been replaced with this cell theory that cells have to come from other cells. So there are a few things that all cells have in common, and it doesn't matter if it's bacteria, archaea, plant cell, animal cell, whatever it might be. All of them have these specific things. They've got the plasma membrane, which surrounds that cell and keeps everything inside. Now, it is important to note that the cell membrane or plasma membrane is not the same thing as a cell wall, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay? The number of organelles that they have is determined by cell size. Small cells don't have a lot of organelles. The larger cells typically have more. And these cells will reproduce to replace old cells or to allow the organism to grow. So when you get a cut, something like that, a lot of your cells get damaged. And so through the process of mitosis, your cells replicate to replace those cells that have been damaged. One time, you were a small baby. Okay? Now you're an adult. You've made lots of more cells in order to grow in size. Okay. Within all of our cells, there is this cytosol. It's a fluid that exists within cells, and all of the organelles and these different things just kind of float in this cytosol. All living things have DNA with genes in them that tell them how to make proteins and all of these other cell macromolecules. Organelles, these are just structures that perform some sort of a function. Now we will see that in certain types of cells, we've got very basic organelles, while in our eukaryotes, we have some more complex organelles. We see ribosomes. These are structures that build proteins, and then all cells need food, some sort of energy, and we see that the main molecule for this energy is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And throughout the semester, we will talk about this ATP and the functions that it has, especially as we start talking about using that energy within cells. There are two main categorizations of cells. We've got our prokaryotes and our eukaryotes. So prokaryotes, pre-nucleus, that karyo refers to nucleus. So we get our bacteria and archaea, two of the domains of living things. Then our eukaryotes make up the domain eukarya, and these actually have a membrane-bound nucleus. So the main difference between these prokaryotes and these eukaryotes is the presence of a nucleus. Eukaryotes have a nucleus, the prokaryotes do not. So looking at our prokaryotic cells, these are all unicellular. Okay, so they're not complex enough to be organisms that are made up of multiple cells. Their DNA is a little bit different. It is circular, so it reconnects to itself, unlike the linear DNA in your cells. They have a nucleoid area. So in place of having a nucleus, they've got this nucleoid area where all the DNA is just in this general region. They don't have any organelles that are bound by membranes, like we'll see within eukaryotes. We do often see cell walls in these bacteria. However, it's made of peptidoglycan and not out of cellulose like we see in plants. They will often have flagellum, which are these tails that help in movement. Uh, and then we will often also see pili, which both increase surface area and then can aid in movement as well. And they reproduce through binary fission, which is shown up here in the top right, where we have one cell and it splits off into two cells. Okay? And so that's how they reproduce. It's not the sexual reproduction that we see in organisms like humans. Eukaryotes, more complex. We've got linear DNA. It's that typical double helix that we have learned so much about. They have a true nucleus, and we can see that in this animal cell and this plant cell, this double membrane structure here containing the DNA. Some do have cell walls, okay, but it's not peptidoglycan like we see in bacteria and some archaea. It is typically this cellulose in plant cells. Reproduction is much more complex, which we'll talk about when we talk about the process of meiosis and fertilization. And they have lots of organelles that are membrane bound. So we see the rough endoplasmic reticulum and the chloroplast and the mitochondria and so on. And we'll talk about each of those organelles individually later on in the chapter. Okay, so which of these things is not found in a prokaryote? Right, the nucleus, right? Prokaryotes do not have a nucleus. Their DNA is just floating in the cytosol with everything else. Okay, so let's talk about this cell membrane, one of these things that we see in all organisms, okay, in all cells. This is a semi-permeable layer, and what this means is that it allows some things to get through, but doesn't allow others. Okay? It's like a couple of bouncers at a club. They'll allow some people in, but they'll keep other people from entering there as well. Okay? And so what this does is it maintains that homeostasis within our cells, allowing certain amounts of water or ions, different molecules to get through that cell. Okay? Whatever that cell happens to need, those things are let in and other things are kept out. We talked in chapter 3 about the macromolecules, and one of our lipids was phospholipids. And here's where we see the importance of those phospholipids is in this bilayer that makes up the plasma membrane. So we see that we've got this hydrophilic head that's attracted to water. It likes the water. We've got our hydrophobic tails that hate the water, so they point away. And so we get this bilayer structure where we've got those hydrophilic heads pointing into the cell and pointing to that extracellular fluid and all the tails on the inside. And so we create this membrane, and anything that wants to get in the cell has to flow through that membrane. Okay. And so within this plasma membrane, it has what we call a fluid mosaic model. And so we've got this bilayer, but then within this bilayer, we've got all sorts of proteins and we've got cholesterols and all of these different things within this membrane. The other thing to point out about this membrane is that it isn't stiff. It's not rigid. It flows. These proteins can move around within the membrane. The phospholipids can trade places throughout this membrane. Okay? And so these cholesterols actually determine how rigid and how stiff this cell membrane is, which is why if you've got too high of a cholesterol, it can be bad because it keeps the cell membranes from flowing the way that they need to. Okay. Again, all cells have a plasma membrane. We've got this double phospholipid bilayer, okay, and this is a transmission electron micrograph of a cell membrane, and we see this bilayer structure here. Okay. So we will pick up here with membrane proteins in part 2 for chapter 4.